Welcome to Inception 101. We're so glad you're here. This is our third session of Inception 101 on observability, and we are really excited to be here today. An introduction to me in case this is new, your first time here. My name is Jenny Hearn. I'm part of our marketing team here at Ascend. And with me on the call today is Ayush Magnanahali, who is one of our field data engineers. Ayush, how are you doing?
Hey Jenny, I'm doing well. Glad to be here today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm really excited for you to show off some of these new features. So I'll bring you back in just a minute, but thanks for being here. A quick overview of our agenda. We're going to recap our 101 session so far really quickly. And then we're going to dive into observability. What is it? What does it look like in Gen 3 of the platform? We'll talk through a little bit more deeply on the metadata collection that we started talking about last week. And then I shall go through all of the dashboards or some of the dashboards and details that are available in Gen 3 of Inception. And then we'll end with Q&A. So we do have that Q&A tab that is available. If you would like to throw some questions in there or in the chat, we'd be more than happy to answer those at the end of this call. So with that, diving right into a quick recap of our session so far. We've been here for the past 2 weeks talking about building in Inception and talking about automation in Inception. Today, we're talking about observability, and next week, we'll be talking about optimization within Gen 3 of the platform. Really excited about that session. So definitely make sure that you have it on your calendar or set a reminder to watch the recording afterwards. But we've been going over this chart, this inception diagram, this architecture every week, and it's just really to ground us in a shared understanding of what the architecture looks like as we go into these deeper concepts. This is probably familiar by now if you've been participating in any of this series so far, but we have these roles that are present on all the data teams. If you're a small team, you're wearing multiple hats. If you're a large team, this is usually broken up. But the idea of Gen 3 of the platform is to really create a unified data engineering platform for all of these roles, where you're doing all of that activity, ingesting, transforming, delivering your data, orchestrating and optimizing all of that. And then Ascend is collecting all of the metadata on all of that activity, which is fed to our automation engine, which enables you to do some really powerful things we talked about last week, including custom automations. And if you choose to expose that metadata to our AI assistant Auto, you have a really awesome build experience with an AI co-pilot who understands your environment and your business, which is great. So if we give this some more context and some more layers, some more depth, we see our data engineering core here, unified metadata that's being collected, our data aware automation engine, and those AI assistants. And really at the top here, we have that plugin architecture that we've talked about before, but we also have this suite of observability features. Because we have all of this metadata, because we see so much of what's happening in your system, it gives you some really great capabilities on observability. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Ayush, who's going to talk more about what observability is and what observability looks like in Inception. So I will hand this off to you, Ayush.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. So Jenny, for those who are attending, Jenny has given you this overview of what Ascend does, generally what the features are. And as we focus on observability today, let's first start with what observability means in general, right? So regardless of the platform you're on, observability really means that you want to understand how your system is behaving, asking the question of what processes are running, what are my resources that are being allocated, is there anything I should be aware of, right? And so these are the questions that any user, but especially any architect or director or anybody who really wants to know how their systems are performing so that they can lower their costs and increase their performance are going to be asking, right? And so the knock-on effects are what are listed below, really ensuring things like data integrity, maximizing performance, and so on and so forth. But the idea here is that if you're working within Ascend, you're going to want to know how to fix things up, make sure they're optimized. So from there, we're going to be jumping into what metadata is Ascend collecting, right? Jenny has mentioned this concept of the unified metadata layer and everything getting access to it. But how exactly does that look in Ascend? And when we talk about observability in Ascend, what exactly does that look like? So in Ascend, we use what's called a resource model. or in our case, what we're referring to is every managed entity being a resource, right? So we have a bunch of examples listed here that you can reference here. And the main one we'll be talking about today is components. But the main way you should conceive of resource models, since we won't be going over it, since that could probably be its own webinar entirely, is that if Ascend manages it, you can think of it as a resource and it'll have its own metadata associated with it. So if we were to go into Snowflake, as we will later, we'll see some tables related to that and so on and so forth. But when it comes to components, which will be the main entity of individual units that people will be conceiving of in Ascend, you'll get things like component checkpoints, component processing states. So then you can ask questions like how much data has been processed? How long did it take for this component to run? How long was this component in waiting, running, retrying states, so that you can check where resources were actually being spent and where your time was actually taken on the data flow. These are the things we reference when we start collecting metadata and using it for purposes on the platform. And so these will be the baseline items that are associated with some of the resources, but it helps us create more advanced metrics, such as test results. So if you have a data quality test, what exactly are you checking for? And what are the end results there so that you can verify the data integrity, as we mentioned earlier. If you have automations, so for those of you who are actually older to Ascend, this is probably something that's even newer to you than some of our newer members, where automations allow us to coordinate between components that exist even across data flows nowadays, right? And so if an automation state, whether it's in an error state, whether it's broken, whether it's actually working, or whether it's currently going off, you would want to know what's happening, right? And that's a little independent of components, but that allows us to create that link that allows us to track that state, right? And so by managing everything as a resource and keeping those states in mind, we're able to use the metadata to better tell us different objects' states. So if everything is a resource, right, does that mean that that's the only granularity through which you can actually establish observability? And the answer to that is no. So we'll be diving a little bit into the micro stuff here, which is something like code, something like data in partition fingerprints, lineage maps, right? Those will generally be referring to, okay, if I have this data going through this pipeline, what are ways that I can more optimally run through it? What are the ways that I can store data that I don't need to reference again, but have at my fingertips? The idea here is that, for example, code fingerprints. If we were to fingerprint the code at one stage versus another, you can think almost of version control in this case. Would I need to reprocess immediately? Would I want to reprocess immediately? Would I want it to hold off on that? But having that stored is always a great idea because then we can tell the system, okay, go back to this or move forward to this or immediately reprocess when we change. So for those of you who are, familiar with Ascend, we used to reprocess immediately. But now with the introduction of code fingerprints, we've also given the option to choose when to reprocess, right? So things like that are where metadata gets really involved at this more micro layer. But something that's even more familiar is probably the data and partitioning fingerprints and where you're going to see a lot of this optimization really kick in. So what we mean here is when you get data from one day or another day and another day, right? You're not going to want to have to reprocess all the old data that exists in your system. And the way we avoid doing that on Ascend is by taking the fingerprints of that data and partitioning of the data, right? For those of you who are familiar with Ascend, this shouldn't be a new concept, but for those of you who are, the idea here is simply that if we see the old data and we see that the fingerprint is the same, no need to reprocess it. So this is where when we talk about optimization and being able to save costs and increase performance, this is where that really helps by getting down to the micro level and telling you, okay, this is what we think is the best optimization. So this is what we think you should do. Furthermore, you'll notice at the bottom, when we talk about data profiling, we also talk about record counts, column statistics. This helps introduce this idea of more micro savings, being able to get down to really fine granularities and tell you, okay, this is where we think these optimizations lie. Here's how we'll go forward with this. So we've talked a lot about these more micro granularities and the smaller levels at which we're able to do things, but let's take a step back, zoom out into what would you look out from maybe a more environment level guide, right? Or from a specific deployment, so on and so forth. Because even if you're working with individual components, flows, you're not going to have the full picture, right? You can try as much as you want, but you'll want to be able to zoom back out and say, where exactly is everything going? And so we use OpenTelemetry to collect all the resources that are occurring, and we'll end up collating it in the Ascend UI for you so that you're aware of everything that's happening in your environment. So for those of you who are architects or directors, VPs, anybody who's really interested in the ongoings of all your individual users, this is where things will get really interesting for you, right? Because the system and user logs, metrics, traces, all being presented on the new Gen 3 architecture is something that should make it a lot easier for you to say, okay, this is where my resources are going, rather than having one billing chart as we did in the past to tell you very limited amounts of detail, right? But even more exciting than that is the concept of events and that being presented to you. So events is a little bit of a new concept here. It's not as though we weren't tracking them before, but it was a little hard for people to get them. So if for those of you who are familiar with the Gen 1 and Gen 2 architecture, events would generally be something that occur within your Spark logs and something you would have to trawl through or download the logs for before you actually got into, oh, okay, this event is something that occurred. I quote unquote printed this statement here and this is where it's occurring. Now events should be much more straightforward. Things like flow runs, component and test runs, planning and optimization. What we mean by that, and I'll show you an example later in a Snowflake table on how exactly we collect those and where you can reference those. But the idea here is that all of these events are now constituted by something we call an actual event, and something will log for you so that you can go back, reference it, and say, okay, this is where this event occurred according to this build, this deployment, this run, etc. So what can I get from this? And it's up to the user on how exactly they want to use these events, but you're very easily able to recreate everything that actually occurred so that you have the ability to, as we say, observe and optimize, right? And so for the most part, I think this covers generally the ideas we want to cover in observability in Ascend. So I'll actually go ahead and show what some of that is doing here. So thanks for taking it off, Jenny. And let me go ahead and share my screen here. Cool. So let's start getting a little bit into the details of what exactly does this look like on Ascend? When I go down into my data plane, where exactly can I look for this stuff? So we've chosen to use a Snowflake table for this particular instance. If you're using Google BigQuery, if you're using Synapse, if you're using Databricks, that will be sitting there, right? It is not specific to Snowflake. This is just the example we've chosen. But I'm taking you to this page. You may not know quite what you're looking at, but let's just go over a couple of the basics here, right? When it comes to the build UUID, data, deployment UUID, all these are referring to are UUIDs that are saying, okay, we're referring to this specific deployment, this specific build, this specific flow UUID. So on and so forth are just referring to specific instances of it. They'll usually have a human readable name if they're some specific event, some specific flow. The UUID will just be something that you'll see if you were to download a more programmatic version of it, for example. But if we were to then look at the actual data in the table, right? What exactly are we looking at? So remember how I was talking about the events and how they're tracked in the tables? So this is what we're referring to here. The UUIDs that you see here, for example, are what we were referring to when it comes to events. So you'll see this UUID associated and a time, but more importantly, you'll see the type of the event that occurs, right? And this is something that is probably fairly new. What you'll see here is, for example, component list complete, component test complete, component plan optimization complete, but also something like schedule flow run, right? Flow DAG, data plane initialized. So basically anything and everything that is occurring within the Ascend ecosystem is something that is tracked within the event table here, right? So you can recreate all of the events that actually occur if you're so interested in doing so. But this is also something that will be presented on the Ascend UI for you to be able to have that at your fingertips so that you don't have to go through the manual reconstruction of it as you would have had to do in Gen 1 and Gen 2 if you were interested in understanding what exactly happened. And similarly, you get other pieces of information like what's my deployment UUID? What's the build UUID? So where am I in my deployments? Which build am I existing? Are there any labels, any data that we want to associate it with? So you can see here, when did it start? What's the deployment? What's the flow that we're actually running in? So you have everything that's relevant to you that could actually occur. So when we say that we're holding these pieces of metadata and that we're actually able to utilize them to best create a reconstruction or to best tell you what exactly is happening, this is what we're referring to when it comes to observability. I'll quickly pop this open because I know we covered like events very specifically, but you can see here we have things like, okay, what are we doing when it comes to resources? So you'll see that we have a very similar model here where you see the kind of the resource that's occurring, what's the name of it, etc. So you're very easily able to take any of these tables, join them together, however you so choose, and get whatever specific pieces of information you want. Because again, This will all be stored in whatever data plane you assign to it. So again, Snowflake, Databricks, Synapse, Google BigQuery, whatever it is of your choice, that will be stored there. And all this is in your data plane, so you'll have access to it at any point. Or you could go to the Ascend UI and utilize it there. But simply put, this is where all the kind of partition, data, metadata, all that stuff lies in there. Right? So that covers what we're talking about when we talk about metadata storage. So what about version control, right? So we've talked about code fingerprints, what we're doing there, so on and so forth. So let's just take a minute. If you're new to the Ascend Gen 3 architecture and UI, this will be what it looks like. This will be the homepage. Some of you who have been presented to before about Gen 3 should find this fairly familiar. Nothing here has really changed. This is just referring to a bunch of the deployments that already exist, right? But what I'm now going to show you is what exists on the backend, right? Each of these deployments here is an individual branch. So you can see I have my own branch here, and each of our developers and users on our platform currently have their own branch. But if we go and look on the backend, this is actually the specific, repository and branches that we're referring to, the backend, right? So you can see here, I have my own, right? So we'll take Jenny's, for example, because hers is a little cleaner than mine because she's a better developer. But if we go ahead and check in here, we go ahead and check in on the commits and that sort of thing. You're able to see what we mean by, okay, we've tracked what commits have actually been, pushed. What's the code change? What exactly is happening in our code, such that we're able to verify here's where this git diff lies. For those of you who are present on Gen 1 and Gen 2, this might be one of the biggest changes on the platform and something that is great to see because you are able to directly track within your GitHub or whatever CI/CD you so bring. It doesn't necessarily need to be isolated to GitHub, but whatever you bring to the table, you'll be able to track it there. You don't have to go through the external process of first pushing there or doing it after you actually make the changes to Ascend. This will be something you can use observability features for. Anything with GitHub Actions, anything related there will all be tracked accordingly. Right? So everything with version control, native to the platform now. Nothing you really need to create external mechanisms for, nothing you really need to bring into the fold anymore. Everything should be present on Ascend, and then should be fully viewable on the UI. Nothing exceptional, fully straightforward. Great. So we've shown you the bells and whistles side of observability, but what about things like lineage maps, things about where my flow actually runs? What exactly do I get to see here, right? So let's actually dive into that a little bit. And so you'll see we have one individual flow here, just called cab snow. So what do we get from it, right? First thing I'll take you to is the timeline. What do we get from this? Turns out we have some pretty nice timeline features now too, right? Couple things to break down here, but we'll just start with the big one. All this is showing you is when did my flow start, where did my resources go, and how long did it take, right? The light blue blocks, ingestion, red blocks, Python, SQL, just transform side things. The green ones, little bit of a new transform type here. This will be more generic codes, generic SQL types, generic Python, less so specific to your data plane and whatnot. But the idea here, and that I want you to keep in mind, is simply that it's showing you the timeline of where your resources were spent and what components took this amount of time. So for example, if we look here, review sentiment took by far the longest and where a majority of the time went. And you can see here as well that we've got some lines going from the dependencies, which is something that might have been a little more difficult to establish on why something kicked off way later in the previous generations. But now it's very straightforward to say, okay, well, the reason driver sentiment took so long is because review sentiment took that long. And so driver sentiment may have finished the last, but it's very easy to tell now why it did that, right? Whereas previously you would have had to go into each and individual component, say, okay, here's how long it actually took for this partition or for this full data set to run. Then we arrive at the conclusion that, oh, okay, so then therefore this must have kicked off that, right? And so that makes it very difficult. For those of you who tried to use the observability features on Gen 1 and Gen 2, may have been a little buggy here and there. So definitely a nice upgrade to get this pretty straightforward, pretty cleanly, and very easy to read. And so we can see here, last couple things I want to cover, just took 2 minutes to run. Nothing too hard to do, but you also have a nice summary view up here, this 2-minute timer here. So anything you want here, whether it's the full picture or you want individual components, everything is generally captured in this lineage view. This is referencing the metadata that we have in that snowflake table we showed you earlier and explaining how we got there with these traces. Great. So this should cover generally lineage maps, generally one of the more useful features when it comes to observability and gives you a pretty good picture of what an individual flow does. But here's another great useful view. That is a successful run that occurred on this particular flow, right? So in the backend, what this is referring to is the metadata of, okay, we hit a successful run on this component. And so each of these components will reconstruct the DAG from that. But this has concluded that each individual component will have an associated metadata state of this succeeded on this run for this build, for this deployment, etc. Right? And so you can see here with the associated run ID at the header level, anything that is related to the metadata is basically captured within this picture. I'm telling you what happened in this run for this flow on each particular component. So things like how many partitions were actually necessary, how many data quality tests were run per component, were they successful, which components are they, what are the dependencies here. So similar to what we are presenting with the lineage flow, we are presenting here simply with more detail, right? We may take away some pieces of information, such as how long did this particular component run, but you're presented with other pieces of information, such as what succeeded, what didn't, what data quality tests are associated with it. And similarly, down the line, you'll see things like automations, etc., where that information will be presented to you so that you can cover that sort of information. And so this is all information that's presented at like the flow, deployment level. If you are, again, interested in more so an environment-wide view, we have this presented on the home page. We plan to make this entirely customizable. So you can pick and choose what exactly it is that you want to be able to have at your fingertips and easily viewable for those of you at maybe a little higher level and more bird's eye view. So you'll be able to see things like events. How many events are firing off in this time period? What are the run durations? You can see, for example, here, would this be something that's a cause for concern, given that it's a major outlier? Where are the failed runs coming from? You can see a lot of them are coming from Jenny, because like I said, she's the better developer and definitely doing a lot of testing. And then what's currently running, what's actually occurring here in our environment and things that we should be aware of. So with all that being said, I will stop sharing and we'll get into a little bit of a future preview of what is upcoming currently in our program, and then we'll shut it down for Q&A. Thanks, Shandu. And yeah, so a couple things just to cover for those of you who are interested in what's upcoming. And for those of you who see this, if you are interested in having things available to you, please feel free to let us know if you think that'll be a good addition to the platform. But access to telemetry data, logs, traces, metrics, these sorts of things, we plan to make directly available in the future on the UI. So this should be something that's very easily available to you and not something you would have to reconstruct from the actual table. So please do not take the time to do that. But we'll also include more fleshed out details on components and flows in the runtime DAG. As we mentioned, we've had things like success states, what data plane you're on, the partitions related to it. This will just be more fleshed out. There'll be a lot more information there, things that'll be quick actions, things that'll be really easy to access whenever you want them. So rest assured that those details will be coming soon if you didn't see any particular details that you wanted. But please do let us know if there's something of interest that we may not have covered and you think would be a good addition. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ayush. Really cool to see the stuff that's already available in the platform and looking at roadmaps and mock-ups of things that'll be available soon in the UI gets me really excited. Also, I don't know about the comment about me being a better developer. I think that's very generous of you. So we do have a couple questions to cover. The first one, just to kick us off with something easy. You've been working with customers in Gen 1 and Gen 2. As you look at the suite of observability features in Gen 3, what gets you most excited?
Yeah, I definitely think that the Lineage map would probably get me most excited. But I think even more so than that, I think there's a lot of plans around improving error messages, making them more actionable, telling users, what exactly is this error telling you? What can you do about it rather than coming to support? And so that's something we definitely look forward to having made available to users. While this may not traditionally fall under observability, I think it's something that we would probably classify as them.
Yeah, absolutely. So one question that someone posed is, can you talk more about what are traces? What benefits do those have? What do those look like?
So traces and the way we're considering them, traces are going to be basically what occurred here, what exactly is the impact of said item. So similar almost to like a lineage map and what you can imagine across other platforms. Should be very similar. We follow the OpenTelemetry definition of a trace. So if you're interested in looking that up, that will also be a good explanation for what exactly we plan on doing there. Generally, we're not going to be doing too much outside of whatever OpenTelemetry offers. So whatever we can pull from that will be what we'll be using here.
Awesome. One more question. Can we see driver and executor utilization in the observability tab?
Yes, I believe that should be the case here. I don't know if that's available on Gen 1, Gen 2. I know we generally make those something that's, I think in the Spark logs that should be available. So I would imagine that that's something that we should make available here through the Spark logs. How it will be presented on the Ascend UI, I'm not quite sure yet, but that should be something that's available.
Great. And then last question for you. When you think about benefits to users on observability, you've talked about error handling and being able to get clearer messages. You've talked about the benefits of self-service. Are there things that you think users should be thinking about now as they think about observability as they transition from Gen 2 to Gen 3? Whether that's like a CI/CD process or other things that you think people should start thinking about as they think about that migration?
Yeah, great question. I would say if off the top of my head, what I would probably tell a customer to look out for is number one, CI/CD. If this is something that you have built around in the past, I would 100% start thinking about it in a new light or talking to us from the Ascend side on what exactly that new model should look like for you or what you think the best model might be. Because this should be a long discussion and something that will impact your team going into the future. But I think it will make things easier for you, hence why you ought to have that discussion. But number two, in terms of observability and other ways that you'll be going about it, I think you should be becoming a lot more self-service. So a lot of what we're intending to do with these new observability features is put the ball back in your court, I guess, the machine in your hands where you're able to really take advantage of the features that are offered on the platform to help yourself answer your own questions. And if it turns out you can't answer your own questions, that means that there's probably a little bit of a gap on our observability features. So that because we want you to be able to not have to get frustrated with what's happening on the platform, get frustrated enough that you come to support, right? We want you to be able to answer your own questions, keep moving forward, keep developing. And so if it's not doing that, that means that's something we got to fix, right? So we're just hoping you have the best time you can on the platform without running into too many issues.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I think that is all the questions that we have. Ayush, thank you so much for your time today. Everyone, thanks for logging on to the call or watching the recording. We really appreciate you. Next week, we'll be diving in with Tessa to close out the series, and we'll be talking through observability optimization on the platform and the performance gains on Gen 3 versus Gen 1 and Gen 2. So definitely will be exciting, and you won't want to miss it. And we will see you there next week. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.